Okay. Next question is, what do you believe? Is it the missing scroll theory? Is it the catalyst theory? And why?
It depends on what day you ask me and what hour of the day you ask me.
Hi, I'm Dan Vogel. In this video, I will respond to Mormon Egyptologist Kerry Muhlestein's 2020 fair presentation titled Egyptian Papers and the Translation of the Book of Abraham: What Careful Applications of the Evidence Can and Cannot Tell Us. Muhlestein took this opportunity to attack the theory that Joseph Smith's Egyptian papers, specifically the Egyptian alphabet and the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, which he called Gael, G-A-E-L, were used to translate the Book of Abraham. This is a straw man because no serious student of the subject believes this to be the case. Apparently, he doesn't realize that his arguments against what might be called the Gael as a translation tool theory also have serious implications for the apologist's reverse translation theory, which posits that the Egyptian alphabet and Gael were created using Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Abraham. At the end of the video, Muhlestein says he doesn't know the meaning of the Joseph Smith Egyptian papers, but he knows what it's not. My critique of his fair presentation aims not only to correct error and poor methodology, but also to teach what the Egyptian alphabet and Gael are, which Muhlestein's presentation failed to do. In his interview with Fair President Scott Gordon following his presentation, Muhlestein gave a hint that he is unsure that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Abraham from a lost scroll, and sometimes considers the catalyst theory, or the belief that the Book of Abraham came to Joseph Smith as a revelation that he mistakenly believed came from the Papyrus. Maybe I can help him make up his mind.
But let's just jump right in and see what we can do. One of the questions that has been a bit of a buzz lately is, what is the method of translating the Book of Abraham? And there are a number of questions that come up in regard to this, but today we will in particular address the question as to whether the Egyptian alphabets and the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language that were created by somewhat by Joseph Smith, largely by his associates, and we'll talk about that as we go along. We'll address whether that was the tool used for translation.
As I mentioned, this is a straw man argument because no serious student of these papers believes they were used to create the Book of Abraham. The reason for this is that they are largely not about Abraham at all. If someone made the claim that the Gael was a key to translation, they made it without knowing the content of the alphabet or Gael, and it probably reflects an assumption about the relationship between the Book of Abraham and those documents based on a statement in Joseph Smith's history that he was continually engaged in translating an alphabet to the Book of Abraham. So the confusion can be traced back to Joseph Smith's official history. Even Nibley assumed there was a connection when he invented the reverse translation theory. In 1975, he wrote, "The brethren at Kirtland were invited to try their skill at translation. In 1835, the prophet's associates, miffed by his superior knowledge and determined to show him up, made determined efforts to match up the finished text of the Book of Abraham with characters from Joseph Smith Papyrus number 11, but they never got beyond the second line of characters. If they were really trying to translate, they soon demonstrated that it simply didn't work." This is pure fantasy. There is no evidence that this event ever took place. Nibley at first tried to date Joseph Smith's Egyptian papers to 1837 during the Kirtland Bank crisis, when Smith came under a lot of criticism and some of the church leaders apostatized. After close examination of the papers, however, Nibley was forced to date them to 1835, but he nevertheless maintained his reverse translation scenario, although it was more difficult to make his case that Smith's scribes tried to outdo him. John Gee and Kerry Muhlestein have tried to keep Nibley's apologetic alive. In his 2000 book, A Guide to the Joseph Smith Papyri, Gee argued, The Kirtland Egyptian papers that have been connected with the papyri appear to be a later attempt to match up the translation of the Book of Abraham with some of the Egyptian characters. If one assumes that the Book of Abraham was the second text on the Papyrus of Hor, a possible scenario is that, having the translation of the Book of Abraham, the brethren at Kirtland tried to match the Egyptian characters with the translation, but chose the characters from the first text. In 2017, Guy asserted that the grammar seems to have been produced from the Book of Abraham, and not the other way round. A decipherer comes up with the translation first, recording insights along the way. Later, scholars systematize them into a grammar book, from which others will learn the language. Phelps and his associates seem to have envisioned the same process with the Book of Abraham. Joseph Smith's translation came first, and any grammar coming later. The problem with this theory is that it invents a historical event for which there is no evidence. This is pseudo-history. It is what is known as an ad hoc theory invented to escape an undesirable conclusion. The only reason for its existence is to serve apologetic goals. Inventing historical events out of whole cloth is not what historians should be doing. Before I get to my response to Muhlestein, a brief overview of the alphabets and Gale will help expose his rather backwards way of coming to the conclusion that these documents were not used as a tool of translating the Book of Abraham. I discussed the content of the 3 Egyptian alphabets and the Gale at length in my new book, Book of Abraham Apologetics, which was published by Signature Books in early 2021. The alphabets are divided into 5 parts or sections. The first part deals with Princess Ketumen and her parents, who lived hundreds of years after Abraham. Part 1 relates to the valuable discovery notebooks, and the characters apparently derived from the Amenhotep Papyrus, now lost, and Ta-Sheret-Min Papyrus, which was taken from the breast of one of the female mummies that Smith identified as the record of Joseph. Obviously, Part 1 is not an alphabet to the Book of Abraham, at least not in a literal or strict sense. The purpose of this part of the alphabet seems to be to explain how the records of 2 Hebrew patriarchs came into possession of these Egyptian mummies, and in the process it gives the history of Egypt's discovery by the daughter of Ham. Part 2 begins with the pure language, a part of which W. W. Phelps had copied into a letter sent to his wife in Missouri in May 1835, about 2 months before the alphabet and grammar were created. So obviously, this too can't be a reverse translation of the Book of Abraham. The content of this section gives the Adamic names for the different grades of gods, angels, ministers, and 5 generations of high priests in the patriarchal line. The middle part of Part 2 copies characters sequentially from column 3 that precedes the facsimile 1 vignette, mixed with invented characters. This part continues the theme of the pure language, listing in the abstract places of increasing happiness on earth, beginning with Eden and then in heaven, specifically the celestial kingdom. None of this betrays an awareness of the content of the Book of Abraham. The last part of Part 2 simply continues to copy characters from column 3 of Joseph Smith Papyrus Fragment 1, without any definitions. Part 3 copies the characters from column 2, Part 4 from column 1, and Part 5 from column 5. It can be easily seen that the alphabets largely rely on pre-Abraham texts and in no way reflects a finished Abraham text. However, there are 3 notable exceptions. The last 2 characters in the alphabets come from the beginning of Joseph Smith Papyrus Fragment 11 and are translated as the land of the Chaldees and Abra-Oam, the father of the faithful. Thus, the beginning of the Book of Abraham comes at the end of the alphabets, not before. The third exception is 1 character from Part 3, copied from column 2 next to the facsimile 1 vignette, which is named Kaya Bra Oam Zubzul Oan, but not translated. These 3 characters appear in the first lecture on grammar in the Gale, and in W. W. Phelps's transcription of the first 3 verses of the Book of Abraham. The implication is that the third character is the first of several characters that fill the lacuna or missing portion of the damaged Papyrus of Hor. None of the hieratic characters from the margins of the translation documents appear in the alphabets and Gale, except that parts of characters from Part 1, dealing with Katuman and Egyptian history, are used to invent characters to fill the lacunae. So it is apparent that the first 3 verses of Abraham were dictated about the same time that the grammar was begun in July 1835. The Gale essentially copies the information in parts 1 and 2 of the alphabets and then expands them in each of the 5 degrees of meaning. It is called a grammar because it includes lectures on Egyptian grammar at the beginning of 3 of the degrees. So, we should not be surprised if the Gale expands the alphabets with a view towards a future dictation of the Book of Abraham. Indeed, we shall find vague similarities in concepts, but no evidence of literary dependence, and certainly not a match of the characters. Logically, it makes sense that Joseph Smith would begin with a simple alphabet, and then discovered that he needed more room to expand his definitions. And it makes little sense in the reverse, that is, for Joseph Smith to use the Book of Abraham to create an alphabet, and then find it was inadequate, and then after creating the Gale, to make no textual reference to Abraham, but instead refer to Katuman. With this rather long introduction, I will return to Muhlestein's presentation.
I think it's important to address some basic assumptions. And one of those assumptions, and I've spoken about this actually before, but I think it bears keeping in mind again, one of those assumptions is that everybody comes in with an initial assumption. People either, and it's a religious choice, whether someone is secular or not, if they're secular, they have made a religious choice. And the religious choice is, do you believe that Joseph Smith could possibly translate Egyptian? We know he couldn't translate Egyptian via ordinary means, the way that we would today using the grammars that we've developed and so on. That was not within his capacity. And so if he was going to translate, it would be through inspiration. So you have to make a choice. Could he possibly translate through inspiration or not? If you have made the religious choice to believe that he could not, that will color your assumptions. If you've made the religious choice to believe that he could, that will also color your assumptions. And that's something we have to think through. But too often, those who have chosen to believe he could not act as if that then is the more objective position. And we need to be clear, that is not a more objective position. In fact, I would argue that if you are aware of your assumption and the way that it colors the way you look at things and interpret evidence, that you are closer to being objective than someone who thinks they're being objective but actually in fact are coloring things by their assumptions. And I would argue that that is actually good scholarship. It is proper and good scholarship to be aware of the assumptions that are made and how they affect you, and it's poor scholarship, and I believe intellectually dishonest, if you pretend that you're objective when you're not, or if you pretend that you don't have any assumptions. That will inevitably affect you more than if you are aware of and trying to deal with those initial assumptions.
Mr. Muhlestein, it doesn't matter what one believes about the supernatural, or even the possibility that Joseph Smith could translate Egyptian supernaturally, because that is exactly what we're trying to test here with the Book of Abraham, isn't it? And a straightforward reading of the evidence demonstrates that he could not translate Egyptian. We have the source of the Book of Abraham, and we have Joseph Smith's translation of the characters. And thanks to Champollion and other Egyptologists, we know what they really mean, and there's no match. Yes, it's really that simple, and has nothing to do with bias. And your attempt to dismiss this evidence as a product of bias is an ad hominem. You seem to think that if it weren't for secular bias, your really weak ad hoc theories, poor methodology, and attempts to escape disconfirming evidence would be acceptable. That's simply not the case. The truth is that you want to declare that since everyone is biased, you have a right to let yours run unrestrained over the evidence. You want to beg the question by assuming Joseph Smith could translate Egyptian through supernatural means. And since that's true, You give yourself permission to circumvent clear evidence by inventing ad hoc theories about missing scrolls and documents and reverse translation in violation of Occam's razor. Your struggle is not with the critics, but with the sources and documents. I don't envy your position. So let's take a moment to consider how your unrestrained bias works, how it leads you to make unreasonable conclusions, conclusions that other Egyptologists find nonsensical. Because Joseph Smith was a prophet and could translate languages through supernatural means, and because he claimed the Book of Abraham was translated from the Hor Papyrus, and because the fragments of the Hor Papyrus that we have do not confirm this, therefore the Book of Abraham must have followed Hor's Book of Breathings on the same roll. Of course, this created a new set of problems and raised many questions, not the least being how the record of the Hebrew patriarch Abraham, who was particularly known to have rejected the false gods of the heathens, came to be attached to a funeral text that invokes the Egyptian gods Osiris, Isis, and Anubis. Another example of how your bias leads you to make unreasonable conclusions runs as follows. Because Joseph Smith was a prophet and could translate languages through supernatural means, and because the alphabets in Gael are not accurate representations of the Egyptian language, therefore Joseph Smith could not have been responsible for them. This too created problems. Most notably, it led to the reverse translation theory, which argues that the alphabets in Gael were created from Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Abraham, probably by W. W. Phelps. The discovery that one of the alphabets was written primarily in Joseph Smith's handwriting complicated this theory somewhat, as it requires that Joseph Smith and W. W. Phelps reverse roles, with Joseph Smith becoming a scribe to Phelps's translation. As we will see, Muhlestein's straw man argument against the critics of the Book of Abraham will provide further reason to reject the reverse translation theory.
Let's just use one example of this assumption. Another assumption, I should say. You can ask yourself, is Revelation a guiding principle for Joseph Smith? Or is it not? That's even for a believing scholar, you will have to operate under that assumption. What was the guiding principle for Joseph Smith? Let me give you an example. This won't be the focus of today's talk, excuse me, but I think it's a good example of the kind of the way that our assumptions color our scholarship, all right? So one of the questions that people have asked frequently is, when did Joseph Smith translate what of the Book of Abraham? And while there are two main camps, there are all sorts of nuanced positions on a continuum in between, but there are two main camps. One of those would be that he translated everything we currently have, and perhaps, or maybe even probably even more, by the end of 1835. And the other would be that he translated up through chapter 2, verse 18 by the end of 1835, and the rest of the Book of Abraham he translated in a few weeks in 1842. And people get quite worked up about this. I'm not sure, for a long time I wasn't sure exactly why. In a minute I'm going to tell you what I think the reason is. But people get worked up about this. And I have done a fairly lengthy investigation of this, and I've been interested to see that I've had people say that I am absolutely sure that it was all translated in 1835. And I've had people say that I was absolutely sure that it was all translated in 1842. Or that much of it was translated in 1842. So let me read to you what I've actually said about this, and then we'll see if we can understand why people care about this. This is something I published. It says, at this point, there is no theory that accounts for all of the evidence. Clearly, either we need to find more evidence or create another model. Such is not surprising when dealing with a process so heavily influenced by the divine and so scattered or absent in the historical record. For the time being, the most we can do is say that it seems likely Joseph Smith translated all of the texts of the Book of Abraham we now have, and perhaps even more by 1835. While such a theory is plausible, it remains problematic because it is simultaneously incomplete and the most probable of the theories proposed thus far. So, at least I think I'm saying there that we're not sure, but one seems more likely than the other, but really we can't tell, we're not sure. I think actually we can tell a little bit more now, and we'll get into that later, but still, I've been perplexed why people were so adamant about this, and wondered, why do people care so much? And finally, it occurred to me that it's because of some assumptions about how Joseph Smith interacts with Revelation. And I think we can see this best if we look at what is the evidence, or some of the evidence. There's a lot of different evidence. Let's just look at one kind of evidence that suggests that he had translated what we have now, and perhaps even more, by the end of 1835. So I'll just give you a smattering of examples. There are more than this. For example, the word Shneha is used as a code word in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. That word is also used in the Book of Abraham, and so it would seem that that comes from the Book of Abraham text.
Muhlestein is trying to give evidence to support his theory that chapters 3 through 5 of the Book of Abraham were dictated in 1835 in Kirtland and not in Nauvoo in 1842, as most scholars believe the evidence supports. Joseph Smith's journal records that on the 8th of March 1842, he commenced translating from the Book of Abraham for the 10th number of the Times and Seasons, and was engaged at his office day and evening. On the 15th of March, the Times and Seasons published Abraham chapter 2, verse 19, through chapter 5, verse 21, in its 10th number. This publication also included Hebrew words and Hebrew-influenced phrases that Smith had learned in 1836, after he had suspended work on the Egyptian papyri. Because the reverse translation theory demands that the entire Book of Abraham predate the Gale, Muhlestein has argued that the Hebrew material was added in 1842 to a previously existing translation. To justify his argument, he uses the 9th of March entry in Smith's journal, which states that he continued translating and revising and reading letters. It doesn't say what was revised. Joseph Smith was editor of the Times and Seasons at this time as well, and we only have one page of what was translated on these 2 days, and it doesn't support Muhlestein's assertion. However, the journal entry clearly states that what was published in the 10th number was translated in 1842, not 1835. Muhlestein's attempt to portray his chronology of events as the strongest is ludicrous. Responding to a 2016 article in which Muhlestein and co-author Megan Hansen asserted that the Hebrew elements in the Book of Abraham are minor glosses, Hebraist Matthew Gray, who is also a professor of ancient scripture at BYU, said that their analysis does not consider the full range of Hebrew evidence in the Book of Abraham, nor does it sufficiently weigh the extent to which Smith's Hebrew studies influenced his later work on the text, especially in the text's creation account. In other words, the Hebrew words and Hebrew-inspired phrases are not glosses, but are integral to the text. Despite difficulties overcoming the Hebrew evidence, Muhlestein attempts to prove that the entire Book of Abraham was translated in 1835. The first piece of evidence he alludes to is the appearance of the name Shinha as a code name for Kirtland in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, which Muhlestein thinks was taken from Abraham 3, verse 13, rather than Smith borrowing from the 1835 code names for his dictation in 1842. The passage in Abraham mentioning Shinha reads, "And the Lord said unto me, This is Shinha, which is the sun. And he said unto me, Kokab, which is star. And he said unto me, Oleah, which is the moon. And he said unto me, Kokabim, which signifies stars, or all the great lights, which were in the firmament of heaven." Note that Kokab and Kokabim are Hebrew words, meaning star and stars, and that amending the passage in Abraham 3:13 would not be a simple matter of inserting Hebrew words. Note also that it is inconsistent to argue that Smith added the Hebrew words in 1842, while at the same time asserting that Shinha in the same passage was not added, but is evidence that Abraham 3 was dictated in 1835. Another observation to make is that Shinha and Oleah are said to mean sun and moon, but this departs from the Gale, which names the moon Flo S and the sun Phlos Isis. This discrepancy is resolved in an 8th of July 1838 revelation Smith dictated, containing specimens of the Adamic language, and is the probable source for Shin-Ha and Oliah in Abraham 3:13, which speaks of both the mountains of Adam-on-Diamond and the plains of Olah-ha-Shin-Ha, or the land where Adam dwelt. An early copy of this revelation, in the handwriting of Edward Partridge, as well as two other sources close to Joseph Smith, read Oliah-Shin-Ha. It therefore seems likely that Abraham 3:13 blends Hebrew and Adamic terminology, thus pointing to an 1842 date for the composition of Abraham 3. At this point, Muhlestein should acknowledge that his use of Shin-Ha as evidence is weak, but he will most likely brush it aside because it suggests a source for Joseph Smith's translation of Abraham other than the papyri. While Muhlestein wants to avoid a perceived problem, Joseph Smith would have no doubt explained that he had learned from his 1842 translation of the papyrus that plains of Oliah-Shin-Ha mentioned in his 1838 revelation mean the plains of the moon and sun. Regardless, Muhlestein's argument is not necessarily with secularists, but rather with scholars in his own faith about the nature of revelation.
Wilford Woodruff mentions Kolob in 1837 and 1838, which comes from the Book of Abraham. That's where we get that.
No, Mr. Muhlestein, that's not where we get that. Wilford Woodruff and others didn't need to rely on Abraham 3 for their information about Kolob. Kolob, as you should know, was discussed at the end of the Grammar and Alphabet volume. Kolob signifies the first creation nearer the celestial or residence of the Lord. First in government, the last pertaining to measurement of time, the measurement according to celestial time, which signifies 1 day to a cubit, which day is equal to 1,000 years according to the measurement of this earth, or Jah-Oah. Joseph Smith dictated this in October or November 1835, well before Woodruff mentioned it.
Joseph Smith speaks on Abraham's astronomical writings in 1838.
Here, Muhlestein alludes to a 6th of May 1838 entry in Joseph Smith's journal, which reads, "This day President Smith delivered a discourse to the people. He also instructed the church in the mysteries of the kingdom of God, giving them a history of the planets, etc., and of Abraham's writings upon the planetary system, etc." This is what the last entries in the Gale are all about. So Joseph Smith in 1838 doesn't have to be referring to Abraham 3. Muhlestein is also aware that an entry in Joseph Smith's journal for the 1st of October states, "This afternoon labored on the Egyptian alphabet in company with brothers Oliver Cowdery and W. Phelps. The system of astronomy was unfolded." At any rate, Muhlestein's reference to Smith's 1838 sermon does not support his reverse translation theory.
So all of this is before 1842, right? Joseph Smith teaches about premortal council and the organization of man in 1839, which is something that's in the Book of Abraham text. Joseph Smith writes about the plurality of gods and revolutions of planets in a council of the gods in 1839, all of which is in the Book of Abraham text.
Muhlestein alludes to a letter Joseph Smith wrote from Liberty Jail on the 20th of March, 1839, in which he poetically states that there will be a time to come in which nothing shall be withheld, whether there be one God or many gods, they shall be manifest, and also if there be bounds set to the heavens, or to the seas, or to the dry land, or to the sun, moon, or stars, all the times of their revolutions, all their appointed days, months, and years, and all the days of their days, months, and years, and all their glories, laws, and set times shall be revealed in the days of the dispensation of the fullness of times, according to that which was ordained in the midst of the council of the eternal God of all other gods, before this world was." Smith traced his notions about the plurality of gods in the Genesis creation account to his lessons in Hebrew. One theme of the 1839 letter is God setting bounds to the heavens, seas, and dry land, as well as the sun, moon, and stars, which doesn't appear in the Book of Abraham, but appears in the Gale. Phlos Isis, the highest degree of light, because its component parts are light. the governing principle of light, because God has said, "Let this be the center for light, and let there be bounds, that it may not pass. He hath set a cloud round about in the heavens, and the light of the grand governing of 15 fixed stars center there, and from there it is drawn by the heavenly bodies according to their portions, according to the decrees that God hath set as the bounds of the ocean, that it should not pass over as a flood. So God has set the bounds of light, lest it pass over and consume the planets." Note particularly the analogy between the bounds of the ocean and the bounds of light, which is the same in Joseph Smith's letter. So again, Joseph Smith's 1839 letter provides no evidence that he had dictated Abraham 3 through 5 before 1842.
He speaks of Adam's death taking place in a 1,000-year day in 1841. Now, you actually can get that from the Joseph Smith translation, but also the Book of Abraham text.
Muhlestein himself knows it provides no evidence for his contention. This information was in the Gale we just quoted. And who doesn't know that 2 Peter 3:8 declares, "One day is with the Lord 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day." Many in Joseph Smith's day connected God's decree in Genesis 2:17, "For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die," with 2 Peter 3:8. So this also provides no evidence that Joseph Smith had translated Abraham 3 before 1842.
And I was perplexed after going through this evidence that some people did not see this as any kind of evidence that he had translated anything in the Book of Abraham that had to do with this before 1835, until I realized from a podcast I listened to that their assumption actually was that Joseph Smith had these ideas and they were kicking around in his head, and then he created the Book of Abraham to codify and justify those ideas. And these are believing scholars. That is an assumption, right? I was operating under an assumption that Joseph Smith received things from Revelation, and then, such as translating the Book of Abraham, and then the things he'd received in Revelation would work its way into his thoughts and thus into his speeches and his writings. Whereas others were operating on the opposite assumption, that he had things in his thoughts, and that then created revelation or translation of Scripture. I reject that hypothesis myself, but that is the kind of assumption that colors what we think and how we interpret evidence.
Mr. Muhlestein, this isn't about interpreting evidence through the lens of different theories of revelation. It's about presenting evidence that supports your contention that Joseph Smith dictated the entire Book of Abraham, and possibly more, in 1835. But you have failed to do so. If you wish to maintain your unlikely chronology of events, you should at least acknowledge the evidence is not in your favor. However, with the demise of the reverse translation theory, there really is no motivation to argue that the entire Book of Abraham, and possibly more, preceded the production of the alphabets and Gale, which is something that you should seriously consider.
So with all of that in mind, let's look at an untested assumption that has to do with the translation of the Book of Abraham. And we can use this, we can phrase this as if we were playing Clue. We can ask, was the translation done by Joseph Smith in the Whitney store using the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language? That's the question that is we're addressing today. And again, if we're going to talk about untested assumptions, the recent Joseph Smith Papyrus project, Revelations Volume 4, which is a very, very valuable tool, and in a moment I'll show you just how valuable it can be, but it also has some assumptions in it. It doesn't state it explicitly, but in talking with its editors, I understand that they had assumptions that actually it was. And it's present, if you look for it, you'll find that in the footnotes and in the apparatus, though it's never stated explicitly, there is an underlying assumption that the grammar and alphabet and the Egyptian alphabet, I'm just going to from now on call those the grammar and alphabet, knowing that there are a couple different documents, but it gets too long to see both every time. That the grammar and alphabet were the tool that was used for translation. That's an assumption that was made and is made by a number of people, and that undergirds much of Revelations Volume 4.
All I see in the notations in the Jensen and Hauglid volume is an acknowledgement that the grammar and alphabet came first, before most of the translation, and that some of the material that was developed was later incorporated into the translation. But to say that the grammar and alphabet was a tool of translation goes too far, and, as I said, is a straw man.
So let's turn this assumption into a hypothesis. If we're going to turn it into a hypothesis, that means we have to test it. We state it, we recognize it, we state it, and we test it. That's what will make it a hypothesis. So we're going to use the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, or Gale, as a tool of translation hypothesis. We'll test this. There are a couple of ways we can test this. One is a logic test. We'll address each of these in turn. Another is to look at the historical test. What do the historical records tell us? And then we can do a documents test. What do the actual documents, the grammar and alphabet, the Egyptian language, the Book of Abraham manuscripts, what do they tell us? And there are a couple of subsets to that. We'll check the Egyptian alphabet and the Gale, and we'll look at the Book of Abraham manuscripts that we now have, the earliest ones we now have, which, as I said earlier, are probably not the earliest ones.
Muhlestein and Guy do not want the Book of Abraham manuscripts that we now have to be originals, because that would mean Joseph Smith's dictation of Abraham 1 verse 4 through 2 verse 18 dates to November 1835, after the Gale had reached the concluding material about astronomy in early October. We know this because evidence shows that 2 of the 3 manuscripts were composed simultaneously by scribes Frederick G. Williams and Warren Parrish, as Joseph Smith dictated, and Parrish wasn't hired until the 29th of October. This is discussed in detail in my book, Book of Abraham Apologetics.
Let's just look at the logic test, and this one won't take us long, but just ask yourself, is it reasonable to have a language you don't understand, a text in characters you don't understand, in a language you don't understand, and just look at it and create a grammar, and then use that grammar to translate the document in front of you? And we can even ask ourselves, can it be done this way? And has anyone ever tried to do it this way? And the answer for both is no. It makes no sense.
Muhlestein's logic test is irrelevant if the alphabets and Gale pertain to different documents than the Book of Abraham. However, the logic does seem to apply to the alphabets and Gale, especially if one dates the translation of the Ketumen passage in the valuable Discovery notebooks before the alphabets, which does seem to be the case. We know the pure language dates to at least 2 months before the purchase of the papyri. The remaining characters come from the columns that flank the facsimile 1 vignette, and should be regarded as an independent translation of a different set of characters than the ones used to produce the Book of Abraham. Muhlestein's logic test is therefore erroneous.
Even W. Phelps, who was very, very much involved in this, and in fact is almost certainly the driving force behind most of these documents, and W. Phelps was a little bit crazy about his language ideas. He had some gifts and he had some crazy ideas.
Motivation to distance Joseph Smith from the Egyptian papers is obvious, but Guy and Muhlestein have not one shred of evidence that W. Phelps authored the alphabets and Gale. It requires the absurd conclusion that Joseph Smith became scribe to Phelps's translation during the production of the alphabets. Smith's alphabet has additional features the other 2 do not, such as the definition of Abraham in all 5 degrees in Cowdery's handwriting. Muhlestein agrees that Phelps probably helped to write Smith's history in 1843, and Smith's history assigns authorship of the alphabets and Gale to Smith, not Phelps. Joseph Smith's 1839 letter from Liberty Jail that Muhlestein earlier referred to echoes concepts in the Gale, like boundaries set on light and the Council of Gods. According to one account, in May 1843, Smith compared the characters on the recently discovered Kinderhook plates, later shown to be a forgery, with characters in his Egyptian alphabet. why would he consult the alphabet or Gale if it were the work of Phelps? Muhlestein's and Guy's attempt to assign authorship to Phelps makes no sense.
Before working with Joseph Smith on the papyri, he was working on translating the Adamic language based on like 3 or 4 words. But still, even Phelps didn't start to try and create a grammar until he had a translation of some words. Even he didn't do that.
Phelps did not translate the pure language. The Adamic words and definitions of the specimen he sent his wife in May 1835 came from Joseph Smith. At this time, Phelps was living in Smith's home and preparing the revelations for publication. He may have come across the sample of pure language in Smith's papers and copied it, or a portion of it. On page 144 of the earliest Revelation book, referred to as the Book of Commandments and Revelations, John Whitmer copied a sample of pure language given by Joseph the Seer, as copied by Brother Johnson, which probably dates to about March 1832. Phelps didn't merely summarize this document, but added characters and 2 additional definitions. It is unlikely that Phelps would do this on his own without Smith's participation. About the time Phelps wrote his letter to his wife, Smith had revised an earlier revelation and added a discussion about the high and patriarchal priesthoods being handed down from Adam through a direct line of ordinations until Noah, which was said to have been recorded in the book of Enoch and would be testified of in due time. So it is probably more than coincidence that Phelps's copy of the pure language also added a reference to the sons of God being ordained. Smith's interest in the pure language was expressed as early as December 1830, when, while revising the text of Genesis, he inserted passages that mention a book of remembrance, written in a language which was pure and undefiled, that was kept among Adam's posterity, and later referred to by Enoch. Smith may have been contemplating the production of a pseudepigraphic book of Enoch at the time the papyri showed up, and decided to incorporate his ideas into the book of Abraham instead, which explains why the pure language sample was included in an alphabet to the book of Abraham, which otherwise seems out of place. The pure language characters and definitions in Phelps's letter not only appear in the alphabets, but they are expanded to show the different grades of gods, angels, ministers, and places of happiness. Note that 5 generations of high priests from Adam are listed, and that the theme of tracing one's ordination back to Adam is also expressed in the opening verses of the book of Abraham. How something that began with Smith in 1832 suddenly became W. W. Phelps's project in 1835 is never explained by Muhlestein and Guy. The only evidence they offer is that Phelps sent a copy to his wife, and one of the alphabets is in his handwriting. Not very convincing.
Logically, this doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense that they would try, and no one ever had, and I think still no one ever has. And so this suggests rejecting the hypothesis. It's not strong, it's not conclusive, but it suggests rejecting the hypothesis.
Mr. Muhlestein, the logic only works if the alphabets in Gale are based on Abraham. If they are not based on the text of Abraham, then there is no logical reason they could not come first.
Now let's look at something we can test much more firmly, and that's the historical sources. What do the historical sources tell us about the translation and how it happened? So, we're going to look at what was an official history of the church, not what will become, but was an official history of the church. And this entry, the entries we're going to look at were probably written by W. W. Phelps and probably written later, but still, Phelps was an eyewitness. He was there when all of this was happening and was very much a part of the process. And Phelps says in the history that the next day after Joseph Smith receives the papyri, that the next day he brought a translation which Chandler, who they were going to purchase the papyri from, Chandler looked at and examined that translation. And so the very first day Joseph has a translation. Let's keep that in mind. A little bit later, that same history writes this: immediately after acquiring the papyrus, so he brings a translation, buys the papyri, then we commence translation of some of the characters or hieroglyphics, and the Lord is beginning to reveal the abundance of peace and truth. So again, the first thing is translation. In both of the official entries that we get there, the first thing is a translation. That's what we get. All right? Words like reveal are used. Nothing about a grammar is mentioned.
Similar to the logic test, Muhlestein's use of the historical sources is irrelevant, since no serious student of the documents has argued that the Gale was used as a tool of translation. Muhlestein is no doubt aware that informed critics have long argued that Abraham 1 verse 4 through 2 verse 2 was written simultaneously by scribes Frederick G. Williams and Warren Parrish from Joseph Smith's dictation. So this leaves no room for laborious translation using the Gale as a tool. Despite Muhlestein's straw man arguments, critics such as Edward Ashmit, Brenton Metcalf, and myself do not expect the historical record to reflect anything other than a claim of inspired dictation of the Book of Abraham. Even Jensen and Hauglid, in the volume of the Joseph Smith papers referred to by Muhlestein, argue for the simultaneous recording from dictation, and therefore, contrary to Muhlestein's assertion, it would be inconsistent for them to privately espouse the Gale as a translation tool theory. In the introduction to their book, they even compare the translation of the Book of Abraham to Smith's dictation of the Book of Mormon, and quote some of the same historical sources Muhlestein refers to in this presentation. The history that Phelps helped to write only states that some of the characters were translated and that the authors of the two scrolls were identified. At most, this would have only consisted of Abraham 1 verses 1 through 3, which were used in the lecture on Egyptian grammar at the beginning of the Gale. The rest of the grammar isn't about the Book of Abraham, and none of the characters in the margins of the translation documents appear in the alphabets and Gale, except where characters were later invented to fill the lacunae, using parts of characters from Part 1. It would therefore appear that the translation of the Book of Abraham was interrupted to create the alphabets and Gale, and then resumed in November 1835 with Williams and Parrish as scribes.
Okay. Then, after a few weeks of journal entries, and again, these are all being made afterwards, but still, they're trying to reconstruct how things happen. Then they write, the remainder of this month I was continually engaged in translating an alphabet of the Book of Abraham and arranging a grammar of the Egyptian language as practiced by the ancients. So the first thing we get are mentions of translations, and later a mention of an alphabet and a grammar. That fits with the logic test, right? Because logic is you have a translation and then you use that translation to try and create a grammar. So far the historical text matches with the logic text.
Again, Muhlestein's logic doesn't apply if the content of the alphabets and Gale isn't about the Book of Abraham. However, it might apply to the first 3 verses as previously discussed. Nevertheless, the logic test is a species of what is known as the Idealist Fallacy, which is the assumption that humans always act rationally. This is what Muhlestein is doing when he argues that Joseph Smith could not have created an alphabet and grammar first, before translating the Book of Abraham, because it's not logical. What did Joseph Smith know about conventional translation and making grammars anyway? Joseph Smith translated by revelation, whether it was a grammar and alphabet or the Book of Abraham. In such case, order is irrelevant. At this point, it is important to observe that Muhlestein's presentation is seriously flawed in a fundamental way, because for him to argue that the translation of the Book of Abraham came by revelation and not conventional means, and at the same time insist that it had to follow conventional protocol, is inconsistent.
But we have a lot more in the historical record. John Riggs, who was a young man whose father owned the inn where Michael Chandler stayed, and was the boy who was sent to get Joseph Smith the night that the papyri were brought there, and was told that Joseph was busy and he'd come the next day, and he went back and relayed that message, and then he was there when Joseph came the next day, and he tells us that Joseph wanted to take the papyri home and examine them, and that his father, and by the way, at this point, John Riggs is not a member of the church, and his father, Gideon Riggs, is not a member of the church. His father vouched for Joseph's character, and that convinced Chandler to allow Joseph to take the papyri home and examine them. All right, so we get all of that from John Riggs, and then this is what John Riggs says. The morning following, so Joseph has brought them home, looked at them over the night. The morning following, Joseph came with the leaves which he had translated, which Oliver Cowdery read. So that means in one day, Joseph Smith had produced several pages of translation. Not a grammar and alphabet, that's not what is mentioned, but a translation, several pages of a translation, which also suggests that We've translated a little bit more than 2 chapters. But anyway, we've got that eyewitness account.
The John Riggs source is problematic, and Muhlestein knows it. It is a second-hand account published by late 19th century historian Edward Tollage in the July 1884 issue of his periodical Tollage's Quarterly Magazine. It claims, young Riggs was present when the prophet was permitted to take the papyrus home with him. Father Riggs vouched for its return, and the morning following Joseph came with the leaves, which he had translated, which Oliver Cowdery read, and Mr. Chandler then produced the translation of Professor Anthon, as far as the professor could translate it. Dr. Riggs, who was present at the reading, says that the translation of the prophet and the professor agreed so far, but there was one language Professor Anthon could not translate, which the prophet did. The part about Anthon is doubtful, since Cowdery reported that when Chandler went to pick up the mummies and artifacts from the custom house in New York City, he was told there was no man in the city who could translate his roll, but was referred to by the same gentleman, a stranger, to Mr. Joseph Smith, Jr., who, continued he, possesses some kind of power or gifts by which he had previously translated similar characters. According to Cowdery, Smith was not allowed to take the papyri themselves, but that Chandler very politely gave me a privilege of copying some 4 or 5 different sentences or separate pieces, and that Joseph Smith gave him the interpretation of some few for his satisfaction. Cowdery then reproduced a certificate Chandler drew up on the 6th of July, 1835. This is to make known to all who may be desirous concerning the knowledge of Mr. Joseph Smith, Jr. in deciphering the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic characters in my possession, which I have in many eminent cities shown to the most learned, and from the information that I could even learn or meet with, I find that Mr. Joseph Smith, Jr. to correspond in the most minute matters. This doesn't sound like Chandler had received a translation, which indeed he could not have done, since there was no one in America that could translate Egyptian, but that the learned had only ventured to give general observations. Owing to Chandler's interest in selling his Egyptian relics to Smith, his certification should not be taken too seriously. However, Cowdery's report casts doubt on the 1884 account of Riggs that Smith took the papyrus home and returned with several leaves of translation. While the Riggs account does not say what the translation was about, Muhlestein assumes it was the first 2 chapters of Abraham and possibly more. This is doubtful, since there is no way in hell that either Cowdery or Chandler would claim that the learned in the East were in agreement with Smith's translation of the Book of Abraham. Most likely, the few lines that Smith had translated were something like what is found in the valuable Discovery notebooks, which identified one of the mummies as Princess Ketumen, or possibly he had commented on the astronomic aspects of the hypocephalus. So the Riggs source doesn't support Muhlestein's assertion that the entire Book of Abraham and possibly more was translated in early July 1835.
Joseph Smith will also say, in that history we were talking about, and again, this is probably actually Phelps recording it, but anyway, I, with W. Phelps and Oliver Cowdery as scribes, commenced, and then some, this is written above the margin, translation of some of the characters, and then, anyway, we'll keep going, or hieroglyphics, and much to our joy found that one of the rolls contained the writings of Abraham. Again, it tells us immediately translation happens. In all accounts so far, everything they say, translation is first. That's what they see.
As previously mentioned, the history only states some of the characters were translated, and that they learned that one of the scrolls was authored by Abraham and the other by Joseph. Beyond identifying the 2 authors, there is no evidence that significant portions of either record were translated in July 1835. Instead, the history clearly states that the translation had only commenced, and promised that a more full account of which will appear in their place as I proceed to examine or unfold them. The only evidence of translation that we have occurring about this time is the first 3 verses of Abraham, and that's because the words and characters appear in the alphabets and at the beginning of the Gale. It is uncertain, but these 3 verses possibly precede the grammar and alphabet.
This is a second-hand account. Benjamin Bullock is the man who he was related to the Kimballs and came with Michael Chandler to Kirtland, not a member of the church, and we have his account as given from his granddaughter. So it's a second-hand account, but this is what he passes on to his descendants as they remember it. Joseph Smith first used the Urim and Thummim to determine that the papyri were of interest, and that he produced a translation that first day.
This is another problematic source and comes from a family history dating to 1952, written by Benjamin Bullock's granddaughter, Clara Fulmer Bullock. It is not a second-hand account, as Muhlestein states. Rather, the story of Bullock coming to Kirtland with Chandler, with the mummies and papyri, was something she heard from others. Beyond that story, the family history is historically useless, since it obviously mixes elements from other sources, such as the history of the church. The part that mentions the Urim and Thummim reads, "With the Urim and Thummim, the prophet discerned that the ancient writings contained vital information to the welfare of the church. Mr. Chandler was completely satisfied with the sample of translation and gave the prophet a certificate to that effect." Clara makes no claim that this information came from her grandfather. The mention of the Urim and Thummim is probably an assumption, but the rest merely reflects Cowdery's account of Smith translating a few characters and Chandler providing a certificate. Regardless, there is nothing in this account to support Muhlestein's belief that a significant portion of the Book of Abraham was translated in July 1835.
Now, it's secondhand, years later, and yet it matches so well with what the Urim and Thummim, no one else had mentioned that at this point, though we'll see that mentioned again in a moment, but this idea that he produced a translation that first day matches so well, we're just getting a variety of witnesses that that's what happened. So again, the timing agrees with the logic test, as we've already said.
Nothing was said about what was translated, so the logic test is irrelevant.
But we can ask, what else do the historical sources tell us as we go to some more second-hand accounts? Orson Pratt is a second-hand account of the first day. He wasn't there on that first day, but he is a first-hand account of some of the time of translation. And this is what Orson Pratt says. "The prophet translated the part of these writings which, as I have said, is contained in the Pearl of Great Price and known as the Book of Abraham. Thus you see one of the first gifts bestowed by the Lord for the benefit of his people was that of revelation, the gift to translate, by the aid of the Urim and Thummim, the gift of bringing to light old and ancient records." Again, nothing about a grammar and alphabet. The historical record is all about translation through revelation and gift from God.
Nothing was said about a grammar and alphabet, but nothing was said about Abraham being translated on the first day after meeting Chandler either. In his 1878 sermon, Orson Pratt, like Cowdery, said Smith had translated only a few characters, but that Chandler had obtained from learned men the best translation he could of some few characters, which, however, was not a translation, but more in the shape of their ideas with regard to it, their acquaintance with the language not being sufficient to enable them to translate it literally. According to Pratt, the prophet Joseph translated these characters and returned them with the translation to Mr. Chandler, and who, in comparing it with the translation of some few characters by learned men that he had before obtained, found the two to agree. Note that there is no indication that on the first day Joseph Smith translated the Book of Abraham. It is doubtful that such a translation would have been verified by the learned. Again, Muhlestein's use of sources is inappropriate and does not support his argument.
In another place, he says of Joseph Smith, "I saw him," and this would be a first-hand account, "I saw him translating by inspiration the Old and New Testaments and the inspired book of Abraham from Egyptian papyrus." Again, very clear, and he uses the word translating by inspiration.
Pratt left Kirtland on a mission to the east with the 12 on the 4th of May, 1835, and returned on the 25th of September, 1835. If Pratt was a witness to Joseph Smith translating the papyri, it could refer to Smith's dictation to Williams and Parrish in November 1835, or to Willard Richards in March 1842 in Nauvoo. He could have also witnessed Joseph Smith working on the Gale and the unfolding of astronomy in October, the characters of which came from the columns next to the facsimile 1 vignette. In any case, this source does not help Muhlestein establish that the translation came first or that the Gale had not in some way aided Smith's dictation of the Book of Abraham. It only shows that the dictation was not a laborious procedure, which no one has argued was the case.
Warren Parrish, who at the time he gives this statement is an enemy of Joseph Smith, no longer a believer, this is how he describes it. And he's a scribe. He is very much a first-hand witness. He says, I have set by his side and penned down the translation of the Egyptian hieroglyphics as he claimed to receive it by direct inspiration of heaven. Again, nothing about grammar and alphabet. Parrish has some handwriting in the grammar and alphabet. He's very familiar with it. He knows what it is. And when he describes the translation process, he says nothing about that. He uses direct inspiration.
Note that Parrish says Smith translated the hieroglyphic characters, not that it was pure revelation. So he could have been describing his work with Smith on the Gale and the Book of Abraham, where his handwriting appears in both documents next to the Egyptian characters. One of Parrish's documents ends with a character with no English text next to it, implying that the characters were drawn first and then the translation entered next to it. It may have been that Parrish first drew an Egyptian character in the margin, and then Smith looked into a seer stone and dictated a translation of that character. This has essentially been the position of the critics, since the discovery that the characters in the margins of the translation manuscripts were sequentially copied from the Hor Papyrus.
Now, this gets to be hard to argue against. If you want to claim that it's by any method other than direct inspiration or revelation from God, you have to disagree with every eyewitness account. Every historical account talks about inspiration and revelation, nothing regarding grammar and alphabet as a tool of translation. If it was the tool, you'd think one person would have said it once somewhere, but that's not what we get. So, if we continue to look at how we're testing this, the logic test suggests that we reject it, but the historical test says reject it. The hypothesis is incorrect according to the eyewitnesses, the people who were actually there. That's not how translation happened.
Again, Muhlestein is arguing against a straw man. No one who knows the content of the Egyptian papers claims Joseph Smith used the grammar and alphabet to translate the Book of Abraham in a conventional way. How could the Gale be used as a translation tool when it's largely not about Abraham? Those holding a catalyst theory certainly don't think the Book of Abraham came from the Gale. I don't think it was either. Instead, in my book, I argue that the Gale represents an independent translation of different papyri and a different fragment of the Hor Papyrus than the source of the Book of Abraham.
Now let's look at the documents test. And this is the part where we'll get a little complicated, but I'm confident we can get through this and understand some of what is going on. As we look at the documents test, we're going to look at only a subset of that. And that is the idea. If you look here, what we have is on the left-hand side, the Egyptian alphabet, one of the Egyptian alphabets. And you'll see as I go through, I'm not going to explain it every time, but there are three, so they're labeled A, B, and C. And then we've got Book of Abraham manuscripts, and there are A, B, and C, and so on. I won't talk about A, B, and C each time and so on. They're on the PowerPoint so that you can see which one when you want to. But you can see that in the Egyptian alphabet, there are characters on the left, and then there are often definitions or explanations and all sorts of interesting things on the right. And they're not always uniform. They're done differently by different scribes and so on. Then if you look on the right, you'll see a Book of Abraham manuscript, and you'll see there are characters in the margin, and then there's the text of the Book of Abraham on the right. And the going hypothesis for those who subscribe to the idea that the grammar and alphabet was used to translate the Book of Abraham, the most common way that is expressed is to say that the grammar and alphabet was used to translate the characters in the margin of the Book of Abraham manuscript. So those on the right, the Book of Abraham manuscript, you can see those Egyptian characters on the left. That the grammar and alphabet was used to translate those characters into the text that we see on the right of the Book of Abraham manuscript. So it's that specific subset of the hypothesis that we can test as we go through and look at the documents. All right? So the question is, did the grammar and alphabet yield the Book of Abraham manuscript, or did was the translation of the Book of Abraham used to try and recreate a grammar and an alphabet? And it may be that it's something completely different. In fact, the more I look at this, the more I think that we don't understand at all what the relationship is in between these documents. But those are the two kind of going hypotheses. Now, of course, there's a whole bunch of stuff in these alphabets and the grammar and alphabet that aren't in the Book of Abraham text at all. The question is that because they'd already translated more and they're using portions of the translation we don't currently have, or is it because they're just coming up with other sources, and in the end, we don't know. In fact, what I should probably stress about this is that there's a whole lot we don't know, and everyone who acts or pretends like we do know is oversimplifying for you. And that's something you should be very careful of. In fact, I believe Dr. Gee will speak about this later, but all of our studies having to do with the ancient world and ancient texts, or studies having to do with modern translation by revelation, or with the Egyptian documents, these are always, in all cases, complex matters, and you can only study them in a complex way. Anyone who gives you a really, really simple explanation, you should have some questions about that. It's complex, and if someone's simplifying, they're leaving things out to try to make their point. And I would be suspicious. In any case, so this is somewhat complicated, but hopefully we can narrow it down.
So after warning his audience against those who leave things out to simplify a complex issue to make a point, Muhlestein then states he will be doing just that. Muhlestein's presentation is not only too simplistic, but it's also so superficial that no one at the end knows any more about the documents than when he began.
So we're going to look at two specific questions as we look at whether the grammar and alphabet was used to translate the characters in the Book of Abraham manuscripts into the text in the Book of Abraham manuscript. One is we're going to look at the Egyptian alphabets and the grammar and alphabet, and we'll look at the characters in the margin and the definitions next to them, and then we will compare them to see when there's text that matches, text in the Book of Abraham manuscript that matches the text in the alphabet and grammar so you can see in this case that the text, it's not a perfect match, but it's a rough match. It's a translatable match. So when they match, do the characters match? So you can see what we're doing. If the grammar and alphabet is being used to translate the characters in the margins, then we should find some match between those, right?
At this point, I must confess that watching Muhlestein go on with his straw man argument and do it in such a circuitous manner is painful. My purpose here, and in my book, is not only to respond to Muhlestein, but to teach about the documents. I especially want to correct the impression Muhlestein gives that the text of the Book of Abraham is reflected in the Gale, because it is not.
The second question then is we'll do it in the reverse order. So these are very related questions, but you have to examine both. We'll look at the characters in the Book of Abraham manuscript and see if we can find those characters used in the grammar and alphabet, and if so, does the text match in that case? All right. So they're similar things, but you have to do both to be able to cover all of your bases.
This exercise is useless because we already have a good idea where the characters in the alphabets and Gale come from. Why doesn't Muhlestein simply tell us that the characters in the alphabets and Gale come from the Amenhotep and Taw-Sheret Min papyri, the pure language document, and the columns near the facsimile 1 vignette, or Joseph Smith Papyrus Fragment 1, and that the characters in the margins of the translation documents come from Joseph Smith Papyrus Fragment number 11. Why does he have to make the comparison so abstract and superficial? Why does he want to tell us what the alphabets and Gale are not, and not what they are? I suggest that the reason has to do with maintaining the reverse translation theory.
So we'll start with the first question, the idea of looking for textual matches in the grammar and alphabet in the Book of Abraham manuscript and see if the characters match, okay? So we're going to do this, and again, this is one of the wonderful, beautiful things from Revelations Volume 4, that they have listed all sorts of characters, and they've given them numbers. And that allows us both to find more easily when we're looking at the same character, and it gives us the ability to talk about it. So I can say character 1.22, you may have no idea what that means, but you could go to Revelation Volume 4 and see. And I now have a number. I tried to do this once before they were given numbers, and it was so difficult to talk about these things, because I'd say, well, the character that's the fourth character down in the left column on page 5. And that was difficult. So we'll now talk about character 1.22, which you can see in the margin there. And you can see that the text talks about going from the Chaldea and traveling into the land of Canaan. All right, so from Chaldea I traveled to dwell in the land of Canaan. If we look in the Book of Abraham manuscript, we get, I left the land of Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. Not a perfect match, but that's a good enough translation match. So the text matches fairly well there, as you can see. But the characters do not match at all, as you can also see.
We'll look at Muhlestein's evidence in a moment. But first, let me tell you what the evidence will show and why. Muhlestein presents this parallel as not a perfect match and a good enough match, and says that the text matches fairly well, but, and this is important, there is no evidence of a literary dependence on a pre-existing text of Abraham. And this is the case for all his examples. There is not one example showing a dependence on the Abraham text. Why is that? Because it hadn't been written yet. Instead, what we will see is Joseph Smith presenting ideas for Princess Ketumen, her parents, and the royal Egyptian family hundreds of years after Abraham. That's why the characters are different. Did you hear me, Mr. Muhlestein? That's why the characters are different. These characters and the explanations were then moved from the alphabets to the Gael and expanded into 5 degrees of meaning. Some of those explanations, especially in the 5th degree, used Abraham as examples or otherwise seemed to anticipate some themes that later were incorporated into Joseph Smith's dictation of the Book of Abraham, which comes from a different set of characters. This is how it worked. For it to have worked in the reverse, ideas taken from the Book of Abraham and applied to Ketumen, and then expanded to include only vague reference to Abraham, as Muhlestein and Guy argue, makes no sense. Muhlestein's first example is the definition of Zub-Zul, which first appears in part 1 of the alphabets dealing with Ketumen. There, it only pertains to relative time, from the first to any stated period after. This evidently refers to the Ketumen passage in the valuable Discovery notebooks, which state, Ketumen, princess, daughter of Onitis, king of Egypt, who began to reign in the year of the world 2962. In the 3rd degree of the Gael, Smith expanded Zub-Zul to include relative space as well as time, and gave Abraham as an example. Zub-Zul, pointing to the end of a fixed period, a road which leads to some particular place. For instance, from Chaldea I traveled to dwell in the land of Canaan. Note that the example is given in the first person, as if quoting a source. But with comparison to the text of Smith's subsequent dictation of Abraham 2 verse 4, there is no literary dependence. I left the land of Ur of Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. At the time he worked on the Gael, Joseph Smith had already dictated the first 3 verses and probably anticipated that his upcoming dictation would essentially be an inspired revision of the account of Abraham in Genesis chapters 11 and 12. In fact, the text of Abraham is closer to Genesis 11:31 than it is to the Gael. And they went forth from Ur to Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. So Muhlestein has no evidence that the Gael alludes to Abraham, and the difference in characters is because one refers to Ketumen and the other to Abraham. Zub-Zul in the 5th degree provides an important insight into Joseph Smith's process during this early phase of translation. Zub-Zul, from the beginning of the creation until now, pointing out or designating at the present time, having foreordained or decreed, or having before seen. For instance, Abraham having been chosen before he was sent by commandment, into the land of Canaan, having preached the gospel unto the heathen, was forewarned of God to go down into Almestra, or Egypt, and preach the gospel unto the Almestraans. Rather than simply reflecting Abraham as one would do in a reverse translation scenario, Joseph Smith reflects another source of inspiration, Josephus, a 1st century CE Roman Jewish historian who was well known to Smith and his contemporaries, who referred to Egypt as Mestra and the Egyptians Mestrians. The prefix simply means God according to the alphabets. Obviously, Joseph Smith was studying Josephus in preparation of a future dictation. Much more can be said about this, but now that we know that Josephus was on Joseph Smith's mind, I would observe that the difference in wording in the definition of Zub-Zul in the 3rd degree might be because Joseph Smith had been reading the account in Josephus, which, unlike Abraham and Genesis, uses the word dwelt. And he left the land of Chaldea, and at the command of God went into Canaan, and therein he dwelt himself. I will now pass on to Muhlestein's next example.
So this will get tedious. In a minute I'll go through it more quickly, but I want you to get the idea of what I'm doing. This took a very long time to go through all of these in a very tedious way, but I want you to get an idea of what I'm doing, and then we can go through it more quickly. So character 1.5 in the Gale has as a definition, her whom Egypt was discovered while it was underwater, who was the daughter of Ham. And character 12 in the Book of Abraham manuscript says, the land of Egypt being first discovered by a woman who was the daughter of Ham. When this woman discovered the land, it was underwater. All right, so you can see, again, not a perfect match, but a good enough match that we can say that's a good textual match. But, again, the characters don't match at all.
Again, there is no literary dependence between the two documents. The Book of Abraham characters on the bottom appear in the lacuna and are a composite of characters from part 1 of the alphabets and Gale. There are several characters in the alphabets and Gale that contain the information about the discovery of Egypt by the daughter of Ham, but Muhlestein chose one that looks most unlike what appears in the margin of the translation document. The character on top represents Queen Catalman, who, the Gale explains, was a descendant of the daughter of Ham, who discovered Egypt while it was still underwater. However, the middle character in the Abraham document is identical to character 1.15 in the alphabets and Gale. The definition in the 5th degree reads, Iota Tau Es Zip Zai, the land of Egypt, which was first discovered by a woman while under water, and afterwards settled by her sons, she being a daughter of Ham. While Muhlestein is generally correct that the characters in the margins of the translation documents do not match those in the alphabets and Gale, and that's because they are taken from different documents, the characters that coincide with the lacunae in the Hor Papyrus are a different story. Those characters were either copied from another line on the papyrus, or invented from pieces of characters from part 1 of the alphabets and Gale. This is largely due to the repetition of the subject, although it should be kept in mind that the character and definition in the alphabets and Gale pertain to the lineage of Queen Catalman, who lived about 800 years after Abraham, whereas the Book of Abraham is talking about the lineage of Pharaoh in Abraham's day.
And now we'll just go through this a little bit more quickly. You can see we've got text matches, but the characters don't match.
Just a minute, Mr. Muhlestein. The bottom characters are invented characters that correspond to the lacuna in line 2 in the Hor Papyrus. Egyptologist Muhlestein knows they are not real characters. Nevertheless, of the top 2 characters from the alphabets, the left character seems to be a marginal addition. The character on the right seems to be repeated in the compound character from the margin of the translation documents. If this character was inspiration for the invented character, it would be in keeping with other invented characters from the same lacuna. However, the alphabets apparently referred to Pharaoh or King Onitis, Ketuman's father, and Abraham 1 verses 21 through 22 are talking about Pharaoh in Abraham's day. Phrases like royal blood are bound to be repeated with a repetition of the subject matter, and this might be the case even without a repetition of the character, because of the so-called comprehensiveness or compact nature of the language. This leads to a theoretical or methodological problem with Muhlestein's test, which assumes a more or less one-to-one correspondence between characters and definition. This ignores the Gale's explanation that a character can yield many layers of meaning, which makes it entirely possible to have a repetition of concept from a different character. Muhlestein is going to blow through these slides with their equal and unequal signs, but when we stop to look at them closer, we will see that some are only vaguely similar, or not at all similar, or that it's at least more complex than his superficial demonstration.
And again, text matches, but the characters don't match.
Despite similar phraseology, the content is not a match. The Onitis of the alphabets in Gale is the father of Princess Ketumen, as mentioned in the Valuable Discovery notebooks. But the Onita of Abraham 1 verse 11 lived hundreds of years before Ketumen. However, the character in the former is part of a more complex character and represents underwater, under the earth, or coming down in royal descent, and Onitis is used merely as an example. In other words, Onitis is not the translatable meaning of the character.
And text matches, but the characters don't match.
The top character, Ho-i-oop, began simply as a reference to a prince, which in the alphabets followed a mirror image of the character defined as princess. As Ho-i-oop developed in the Gale, it was mentioned in the 4th degree that the prince was a true descendant of Ham, the son of Noah, and in the 5th degree that this prince was an inheritor of the kingly blessings from under the hand of Noah, but not according to the priestly blessing, because of the transgressions of Ham, which blessing fell upon Shem from under the hand of Noah. This theme of withholding the priesthood is worked into Joseph Smith's subsequent dictation of Abraham 1, verses 25 to 27, which appear next to the two bottom characters. These characters were invented from characters in part 1 of the alphabets dealing with Ketumen and fill the lacuna in line 2 of the Hor Papyrus. The passage in the Book of Abraham has nothing to do with the prince, and the whole of the Abraham passage is not reflected in the Gale. Thus, once again, we see a character from the alphabets about a prince from Ketumen's time that gets developed in the Gale towards a theme that later appears in a different context in the Book of Abraham, next to characters created out of bits of characters from the same place. This direction of development makes sense. The opposite does not.
And that just keeps happening.
Muhlestein compares a character in part 1 of the alphabets in Gale, with the meaning of virgin or virtuous, with Abraham 1 verse 11, which mentions 3 virgins being sacrificed to the heathen gods because of their virtue. In the context of Princess Ketumen, it is one definition among others that discusses the various conditions of a female member of the royal family, including a queen, a widowed queen, a remarried queen, and an unmarried queen, which leads to a comment about virtue and virginity. Similar definitions involve males. None of this is about the Book of Abraham. So, as previously explained, given the compact nature of Egyptian, as Joseph Smith explained it, there is no requirement that the complex hieratic character in the margin of the translation manuscripts should include the simple character in the alphabets and Gale. Such might have been the case if the latter were reverse engineered from the former, but it wasn't. Rather, it was a separate and distinct translation of different characters from different documents.
With each textual match I was able to find.
Here, Muhlestein compares the translation of a character from the pure language in part 2 of the alphabets with the third character that appears in W. W. Phelps's transcription of the first 3 verses of the Book of Abraham, because both happen to mention high priests. Do we really expect the 5 degrees of Abraham to match a character from the pure language?
I tested it, and in all the ones I'm showing you right now, when the text matched, the characters did not match.
The definition of Zool begins in part 1 of the alphabets as a reference to relative time back to creation, as in the year of Ketumen's birth and death, but evolves in the 5th degree of the Gale into a reference about Abraham's birthright to the priesthood, through his fathers, and a promise that his progenitors will bless humankind by preaching the gospel. Muhlestein compares this to Abraham 2 verse 11, but there is no literary dependence, not even a hint that this text exists. The Abraham text expands on Genesis 12 verse 3, which is in bold print, in light of John 8:56, about Abraham seeing Jesus' day and knowing about the gospel, and Smith's ideas about priesthood, which he had already introduced in the first 3 verses of Abraham. Genesis doesn't use the term seed, but the Book of Mormon does. When Nephi mentions the covenant which should be fulfilled in the latter days, which covenant the Lord made to our father Abraham, saying, "In thy seed shall all the kindreds of the earth be blessed." The Gael and Abraham might discuss a similar subject, but there is no literary dependence one way or the other.
Now, things get a little interesting after a while, because here we do find one. We've got in the land of the Chaldees, and that equals, or that one does match. Whoops, I didn't mean to push that button yet. That one does seem to have a good match.
Here, Muhlestein compares the lecture on grammar on the first 3 pages of the Gael with W. W. Phelps's transcription of Abraham 1, verses 1 through 3. There is a match because these 2 characters are the first 2 characters that appear in the Hor Papyrus, where the other characters in the margins were also taken from. These 2 characters also appear at the end of the alphabets. So, after translating other records and the first part of the Hor Papyrus, that is, some of the characters in the vertical columns that flank facsimile 1, Joseph Smith moved to what is known as Joseph Smith Papyrus Fragment 11 and began translating the Book of Abraham. This is why the alphabets in Gael could not be used to translate the Book of Abraham. So even the alphabets tell us the source for the Book of Abraham came at the end and not to expect the characters to match.
In any case, okay, so now we're going to go on and find, look at some more. So we've got another text match that the characters don't match.
Here, Muhlestein compares a character from the pure language portion of the alphabets that pertains to Adam, or the first man or king, with Abraham 1 verse 3, where Abraham says he has a right to the priesthood through his fathers back to Adam. Obviously, the characters are not going to be a match, but the subject matter is only vaguely similar. Muhlestein's choice of comparison is misleading, since there is an exact match in the alphabets in Gael to the character in the margin of W. W. Phelps's transcription of the first 3 verses of Abraham. The character appears with the previous 2 characters at the beginning of the Gael, where it is dissected and each part given a meaning. Why didn't Muhlestein use that? The character is named Kaya Broam Kaya Bra Oam Zubzul Oan, and defines Zubzul Oan as the firstborn, or the first man, or father, or fathers. So the character and content match, and that's because it does come from the Book of Abraham.
And more where the text matches and the character doesn't match.
The match in text is a reference to Adam. Muhlestein compares the same complex character in the translation manuscript, Kaya Broam, Kaya Bra Oam, Zubzul Oan, which incidentally mentions Adam, with a simple character in the Gael representing Adam. The text really doesn't match, and the characters are not supposed to match.
And so on and so on.
Here, Muhlestein compares Beth Ka in the alphabets in Gael about a better place of residence to Abraham 1 verses 1 through 2, which states that Abraham saw that it was needful for me to obtain another place of residence, and seeing there was greater happiness and peace and rest for me, I sought for the blessings of the fathers. However, in the alphabets in Gael, Beth Ka fits into a larger scheme and has an independent evolution that has nothing to do with the Book of Abraham, although the similar wording is perhaps due to the fact that Smith dictated the first 3 verses of Abraham about the same time. In the alphabets, Beth Ka is one of several characters pertaining to the different places of happiness, beginning with Eden and ending with the celestial kingdom, which continues the theme of the pure language, that is, different grades of gods, angels, ministers, and places of happiness. Muhlestein compares Beth Ka to the second character in the translation manuscript, despite the fact that the words are either keyed with a number 1 to the first character or prefaced with a new character which looks a lot like Bethka. Either way, the words in the translation manuscript are linked to either Beth or Bethka, which are defined on the second page of the Gale following dissection of the first character. And there is a match of both character and content. And that's because we are talking about the Book of Abraham.
I won't bore you with all of this, but you can see that again and again, we don't get it.
In part 1 of the alphabets, the character simply represents government, power, or kingdom. But in the Gale, it develops to include righteous government, and finally in the 5th degree, to specifically refer to patriarchal government, which sometimes means any priestly government, whether by the direction of heaven or by the tradition of the heaven. Later, Joseph Smith picked up this theme when he dictated Abraham 1 verse 26 about Pharaoh imitating patriarchal government, but not having the right to the priesthood. However, there is only vague similarity and no evidence of a pre-existing Abraham text.
Now, there are two cases that are more difficult, and this is where this gets complex, but I think we can get through this. Here's a really interesting one. So as we look at the characters on the papyrus, and that's part of what we have to do as well, is look at the papyrus characters and see how they end up on the alphabet and grammar and so on and so on. So here you can see these papyrus characters, and you can see how they end up in the Egyptian alphabet, and you can see how those characters, not particularly well drawn, but you can see how the papyrus characters become the characters that we find on the alphabet. It's not perfect, but it's a decent enough match. And then you can see in another one of them, so these are each documents written by a different hand. So in another one, still kind of, you can tell, but it's not a great match. But I think it is the same one. This one, it's even harder to tell, but I think they're the same one.
I don't know why Muhlestein hesitates about the characters matching. In the context of the alphabets, there is no question that they are the same. The last part of Part 2 of the alphabets begins copying characters in sequence from column 3 of the Joseph Smith Papyrus Fragment 1 that flanks the facsimile 1 vignette, and Part 3 is copied in sequence from column 2, which is where the character in question was copied from. So, there is no doubt where the characters Muhlestein is discussing come from. The two characters represent Osiris, and the one on the left is a man with a staff and represents great.
Then we get in the Book of Abraham manuscript, we get this. So there's nothing matching the character on the right and kind of matching the character on the left, right? And in case you are wondering whether these really are the same characters in the alphabet and grammars and in the Book of Abraham, you see they all have the same transliteration.
The last one actually comes from the Gale, page 3, and appears in the lecture on grammar. Again, why the hesitation? It's only a simplified version. It even has an extra detached dot on the left, like alphabet B, which is Oliver Cowdery's. Given that it has the same name, there's no reason to put a question mark on it.
So, the bottom one is the grammar and alphabet. I said it was the Book of Abraham, but it's the grammar and alphabet. And then we get that character in the grammar and alphabet showing up, or it seems like the same character, showing up in a Book of Abraham manuscript.
This character also appears as the third character in the margin of W. W. Phelps's transcription of Abraham 1 verses 1 through 3. The placement of this character coincides with the lacuna. There is no doubt that the character in the margin of Phelps's transcription is the same one used in the grammar volume, as the discussion includes all three characters.
So this would suggest, in this case, that it came from the papyrus, because if we go back, you'll see that the Book of Abraham manuscript, you cannot recognize that as having to do with what's on the papyrus at all, but you can see it kind of going through variations that could arrive at that symbol. And so, if that were the case, then that would suggest that the Egyptian alphabet was used to at least create the character that is on the Book of Abraham manuscript.
I don't know what Muhlestein means by create the character. The character comes from column 2 next to the facsimile 1 vignette, and it was placed in the margin of W. W. Phelps's transcription and corresponds to the lacuna of Joseph Smith Papyrus fragment number 11. Except for the invented characters in the lacunae, the characters in the margins of the translation manuscripts were not created, but were copied sequentially from Joseph Smith Papyrus fragment 11. Muhlestein and Guy believe the characters were added to the translation manuscripts later, and Muhlestein here suggests that the third character may have been taken from the Gale. If such were the case, the first question that arises is why the characters were written in different ink. The first three were written in heavier ink that matches Phelps's ink flow, whereas the text that was entered into the translation book by Warren Parrish is lighter, as are the characters in the margin, suggesting that the characters were entered at the same time as the English text. The second thing to notice is that only the first three characters in the translation documents appear in the Gale, which suggests that the translation was interrupted and that a November date for the continuance of dictation with Warren Parrish and Frederick G. Williams as scribes fits better than the theory that they had merely copied an existing text dating to July. If there had been more translated in July, Phelps would have likely entered it into the translation book at the same time, and the Gale would have used more characters from the margins and made explicit reference to the text of Abraham, that is, beyond the first three verses.
But it turns out this one is not so simple. This one's actually quite complicated, and I'll try to show you why. So we have there the grammar and alphabet character, and I'm showing you the actual writings in the typescript of it, so that you can read it a little bit more easily typed up there. So we've got that actual character in the Gale, or the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language. And you can see up at the top, where you've got the full character, it says, Ki Abraham Zub Zolan. But in that bottom part, and I want you to look in the middle, so you've got it saying Ki Abraham Zub Zolan, and then you say this character shown dissected. And then you just get parts of the character. And one part of the character does say Ki Abraham. So it seems to match that text up above. But the interesting thing is that we have another character that's labeled, so the characters on the left are labeled character 3.11, and the character on the right is 5.28. And that one is Abraham, all right, or Abraham, once it's Abraham. So, and you can see that it is similar to the right-hand part of character 3.11, which is Ki Abraham Zub Zulan, or its variations, right? So 5.28 doesn't have Ki and it doesn't have Zub Zulan. But let's look at this character that was not given a number in Revelations Volume 4, but that's because they were just creating the tool that now allows me to do this analysis to see, oh, there's something going on here that it should have had a number. So I'm not criticizing them for that. In fact, they've told me, oh yeah, now I see that we should have given that a number, but they created the tool that made it possible for us to see that. So we are going to call this character X.
I'm not so sure it should have its own number, since it's only part of a compound character. Kaya Broem, Kaya Bra Oem, Zub Zul Oen. After it dissects the character, it then appears to define the middle part, putting Kai, the dot, and Abroem, the hook, together.
And character X, you see that Ki Abraham right there, it has the key added that's different than what's in 5.28, but it doesn't have the Zub Zul on.
The Kai is the dot, and Zubzul Oen is the curved horizontal line that connects the characters, which is all explained on the previous page. Broem doesn't get defined in the Gale. It gets defined at the end of the alphabets.
All right, so there are no definitions provided for this in for the 3.11 character, but in 5.28 the definition is a follower of righteousness and a rightful heir.
The actual name of the character on the left is Kaya Broem, Kaya Bra Oem, Zubzul Oen. It's named in the alphabets, but gets defined in the grammar volume, except for the Kaya Broem part, which gets defined at the end of Joseph Smith's alphabet in Cowdery's handwriting.
And here's where you can see that right there.
The second definition from the top is where Abroam gets defined at the end of Joseph Smith's alphabet in Cowdery's handwriting. Note that this important definition appears in Joseph Smith's alphabet, not in the other two, showing that Cowdery treats it as the main alphabet.
Now, as we look at this character in the Book of Abraham manuscript, you can see that it's got 5.28 up there, and then it's got 3.11, but that part of it is similar to 5.28. And you've got a textual match there. They do seem to be similar with that textual match, right? Just for that part of the character, which agrees with the character 5.28. So the whole character doesn't match, but the partial character does match when it's deconstructed. And that character actually seems to have become a different character. The 5.28, when it's deconstructed or dissected, it seems to become a different character that is used elsewhere, and that's when we get the textual match, when it's used elsewhere. So it's not such a simple match, and I don't want to get us bogged down in this, but you can see that when we have just this 5.28, when we have it as a dissected character, that's when we get our best textual matches. Not when it's the whole thing together, but when it's a dissected character. So it may actually be that it's not character 3.11 that matches, but it's character 5.28, and so this may not actually show us anything about that little trail we saw of the papyrus characters and how it came down into various characters in the Egyptian alphabet and grammar, because this actually seems to be, this translation seems to be coming from a different character, but we can't be sure. In any case, this little part of it here does not match in any way at all what's on the papyrus.
What? The whole character matches what's on the papyrus. In its dissected form, Joseph Smith named the first part Abroam and associated it with the W loop character, which is the second character on Joseph Smith Papyrus Fragment 11, and which Joseph Smith gave the same name. The next part of the character, Kaya Bra Oam, doesn't appear by itself, except in the Gale, where it is defined. As previously discussed, each of the dissected parts of the character is given a name and meaning in the Gale on the previous page except Abroam, which is defined in Joseph Smith's alphabet in Cowdery's handwriting. Muhlestein seems confused about what the Gale is attempting to explain in this first lecture on grammar. It can't be perfectly explained, but each part, Abroam, Abraoam, and Zubzul Oan, has a parallel in Abraham 1, verses 2 through 3. The best fit comes from Cowdery's addition to Smith's alphabet of Abroam in all 5 degrees. However, the definition of Abraoam in the Gale is the same as Abroam in the 5th degree, but Kaya Bra-Oam adds the element of right by birth, which reflects another part of the passage in Abraham. Also note that the text of Abraham doesn't list patriarch, which might point to the first 3 verses coming before the Gale was started. Finally, Zubzul Oan reflects still another aspect of the Abraham passage. So Muhlestein is wrong not to consider the entire character.
Here's another curious and interesting case. This was discovered by my colleague John Gee, and it's where we get this in the grammar and alphabet. You get one character who says a woman is married or unmarried, signifies all or any woman, and another that says underwater, and another that says the eye, or to see, or sight, or sometimes me, myself. And then when you see all the characters put together, it says Egypt, the land first seen by a woman underwater. And you can see that character here, where it says the land of Egypt being first discovered by a woman who was the daughter of Ham and the daughter of Zeptah, and so on and so on. So you can see the character matches are not perfect, but it's fairly decent there. And so this suggests that it goes in reverse order. What you have is a papyrus character that's all put together, but then when you dissect it, and then they re-put it back together, it gives us this translation. And so that seems to be coming from the papyrus and the translation first, and going in reverse order to the alphabet and grammar.
Muhlestein's use of this character as evidence for the reverse translation theory is flawed. Muhlestein and Guy are incorrect in their claim that this character comes from the Hor Papyrus. The group of 3 characters in the margin of the translation manuscript on the bottom were among those that were invented to fill the lacuna in line 2 of Joseph Smith Papyrus Fragment 11. And, like the other invented characters, it too incorporates characters from Part 1 of the alphabets, which is about Princess Ketumen and her mother, and the female line back to Ham's daughter, who discovered Egypt while it was still underwater. The development of this and other associated characters in the Gale was to give the history of one of the female mummies and to explain how she came in possession of a record written by a Hebrew patriarch. The origin of the character, therefore, is likely the Ta Sheret Min papyrus, found on the breast of one of the female mummies that Joseph Smith associated with ancient Joseph. Understandably, Joseph Smith would later draw on this discussion to explain the lineage of Pharaoh in Abraham's day, but it doesn't make sense in the reverse. That is, for a character to be taken from an Abraham context and then put into a Ketumen context. If the alphabets and Gale were reverse engineered from the Book of Abraham, it would have stayed in the context of Abraham. None of the definitions of this character mention Abraham or give a hint of a pre-existing text. Muhlestein and Guy's reconstruction would also imply that the characters were in the margins of the translation documents before the alphabets were created. So if the alphabets in Gale were reverse engineered from the Book of Abraham translation, why weren't more characters from the margins used? Why only the first 3 characters from the beginning and a few others from the lacunae? It seems Muhlestein and Guy's explanation for this character creates more problems for their theory. But, as we will see, they have got it all wrong.
And so that suggests, as we get from this is the character on the papyrus.
Evidence for the reverse translation theory comes from this misidentification. These are not the same characters. In a previous video, I reviewed Guy's attempt to overturn what he called the sequential theory, which observes that the characters in the margins of the translation documents were copied sequentially from the Hor Papyrus, except where the lacunae were filled with invented characters. Rather than admitting some of the characters were invented, Guy instead tried to argue that they were very poor copies of some hieratic characters from other lines on the papyrus. Here, he compared the invented characters to a group from line 5 of Joseph Smith Papyrus Fragment 11. The problem with Guy's comparisons is that the scribe's copies of characters on either side of the lacuna are perfectly recognizable, whereas in the lacunae they are not. Moreover, Guy doesn't recognize that parts of the invented characters are really from the alphabets, where they deal with Ketumen and her family. Nevertheless, this misidentification leads Muhlestein to an erroneous conclusion.
That suggests that when we get this little character created here, obviously it doesn't match, so we're going from papyrus. The character on the left is the Book of Abraham manuscript. The character on the right is the alphabet and grammar. And so it would seem that we've gone from the papyrus to the Book of Abraham manuscript and then to the alphabet and grammar. So that suggests that we're translating first and then trying to create a grammar afterwards.
This is so wrong that it's hard to find words. What more evidence does one need to show that Muhlestein and Guy do not know what they are talking about when it comes to these documents? They have come to the wrong conclusion based on an incorrect identification of the source of characters in the margin of the translation manuscripts. From this misidentification, Muhlestein argues that the 3 characters were incorrectly copied into the margin of the translation documents, and then the middle character was copied into the alphabets in Gale. As previously mentioned, the origin of the alphabet character is likely the Ta Sheret Min papyrus, which was found on the breast of one of the female mummies and associated with ancient Joseph by Joseph Smith. Unlike the characters Guy and Muhlestein suggest, the match is identical, although sometimes reversed. The underwater character also appears in the Amenhotep papyrus, copied into the valuable discovery notebooks and associated with Princess Ketumen. In fact, at the beginning of this paragraph of hieratic characters are the characters from which the passage about Ketumen was said to have been translated.
Those are the two cases where we can make something of it. Everything else doesn't match. And in those cases, we have one that's ambiguous and one that tells us that most likely they have a translation first, and then you're getting the alphabet and grammar.
I have just demonstrated this to be incorrect.
So, if we're going to summarize this first question, and we need to hurry here, there are very, very few matches. And inconclusive evidence suggests possibly going from the grammar to the Book of Abraham, but more conclusive evidence suggests going from the Book of Abraham to the grammar.
Muhlestein's summary here is ludicrous. His declaration that he has provided conclusive evidence that the content of the Gale relies on the Book of Abraham is nonsense. He has provided his interpretation of only one character that we found to be totally incorrect. As I have demonstrated, these conclusions are false, primarily because the alphabets in Gale are not about Abraham, let alone the Book of Abraham. The characters do not match because the characters come from other sources, like the Amenhotep and Talsheret Min papyri, as well as the pure language document, and deal with other subjects that later provide inspiration for Joseph Smith's dictation of the Book of Abraham, where they are transmuted into a different context. The alphabets in Gale constitute an independent translation, separate from the Book of Abraham. We saw that mostly in the fifth degree, Joseph Smith's interpretations seem to anticipate a future dictation of the Book of Abraham, but at no time did it demonstrate a text that already existed, that is, except for the first three verses. This is a problem for Muhlestein and Guy's reverse translation theory, something they don't seem to appreciate.
Thus, statistically or quantitatively, because there are so few matches, this theory that they're using the alphabet and grammar to translate the characters in the margin, it just doesn't work, and neither does it qualitatively. It just doesn't work.
It seems Muhlestein doesn't want to talk about where the characters in the alphabets and grammar do come from, or the original context of the explanations. By comparing characters and vague subject similarity, he keeps it at a very superficial level, and no one learns anything. Because his analysis is deeply flawed, his conclusions are often wrong, and because he responds only to a straw man, they are also irrelevant.
So let's look at the second question, and we can do this one very quickly. How are the characters next to the Book of Abraham text used? So, two Book of Abraham manuscripts begin with this, the sign of the fifth degree of the second part, and you can see the character that they have there. In the Gale, the fifth degree looks somewhat similar, but really not. But this is the sign that's in the margin at the beginning of the Book of Abraham C, which is the only one that has the real beginning of the text.
The first character appears at the top of two Abraham documents in the handwritings of Frederick G. Williams and Warren Parrish. They are notes of uncertain meaning and not part of the translation. So I don't understand why Muhlestein even brings it up, and then compares it to the first character on W. W. Phelps's transcript of the first three verses. They have nothing to do with each other. Baffling, to say the least. In my last video responding to John Guy, I offered an explanation for the character in the top margin. Regardless of its meaning, it's not the first character of the translation text in the Williams and Parrish documents, which begin with Abraham 1 verse 4, and in no way should be compared with the actual first character corresponding to Abraham 1 verse 1. Muhlestein doesn't seem to know his way around these documents.
And it's also used in the Egyptian alphabets to say land of the Chaldees. It's not in one of the Egyptian alphabets. So that's a good textual match with a character match there.
The bottom character from the Gale once appeared at the beginning of Joseph Smith Papyrus Fragment number 11, before it was further damaged. The fact that it also appears at the end of the alphabets shows the order in which the translation proceeded. It was copied by W. W. Phelps into the margin of his transcription and numbered with a 1 and keyed to "in the land of the Chaldeans" in the text. The three characters in Phelps's transcription appear on pages 1 through 3 of the Gale, and except for parts of the invented characters, no other characters from the margins appear in the Gale. This is hard to reconcile with Muhlestein and Guy's belief that the characters existed in the margins before Joseph Smith began working on the alphabets and Gale. especially since the latter were supposed to be a reverse engineering of the former.
But those actually, sorry, no, the characters don't match, but the text does match. So the characters don't match well, but the text does match. And that's already something that's a character we looked at earlier.
Again, the top character has nothing to do with the bottom one. The top one has no text to compare. The comparison is between the end of the alphabets and W. W. Phelps's transcription, both of which come from the beginning of Joseph Smith Papyrus Fragment number 11. And those characters match. So Muhlestein's use of the top character is irrelevant.
If we look at the first 10 characters in the margins of the Book of Abraham, they do not appear anywhere in the Book of Abraham or in the alphabets and grammar.
When the sources of the alphabet characters are understood, we do not expect the characters in the margins of the translation documents to show up in the alphabets and Gale. They are two distinct projects with only slight overlap. As we have learned, only the first three characters in the translation documents have a match in the alphabets and Gale, which suggests that the translation was interrupted. This is not what one might expect if the translation had been completed before the alphabets and Gale. Why do the three matching characters also have a textual match to the Book of Abraham, whereas the remaining comparisons to the Book of Abraham are vague and only superficially similar? This is a serious problem for the reverse translation theory.
We do get a couple characters that partially match.
This character was invented to fill the lacuna. It's not even hieratic. Muhlestein's comparison to a single vertical line can't be taken seriously. As discussed in my previous video, Guy tried to compare the invented group of characters with another group on the papyrus, but it wasn't even a close match.
And so I'll just show you these quickly, but the text doesn't match.
These characters are not hieratic, but were invented to fill the lacuna. Guy attempted to find a parallel group of characters, but failed. The character on the left comes from the alphabets and Gale, but Muhlestein is incorrect that there is no parallel in content. Both have to do with the origin of patriarchal government.
So you can see here where part of the character matches and part doesn't match, but the text does match. Or the text doesn't match.
The top characters were also invented to fill the lacuna. Guy was unable to find a match of hieratic characters. The right character matches a character in the alphabets and Gale dealing with Ketumen. Zubzul is used to indicate relative time, from the beginning of creation until now. While this originally had reference to Ketumen, in the Book of Abraham it apparently dealt with the part of the passage in Abraham 1 verse 28, where Abraham says, "I shall endeavor hereafter to delineate the chronology, running back from myself to the beginning of creation."
And we get that again and again. Somehow this isn't clicking very quickly. Whenever we get these partial matches.
At this point, Muhlestein starts comparing random characters that have no context and ultimately produce no usable evidence.
We do get, as I said, a couple partial matches, but the text doesn't match. We have no matches in many cases.
Here, he even compares characters in the margin of the translation manuscript to those in the alphabets that were merely copied from the columns that flank facsimile 1 and have no definitions. For what purpose, I don't know.
And so on, but we're just going to click through this to see. Those somewhat match, but the text doesn't match.
There is no match of either the character or the content, because the bottom character comes from the pure language section of the alphabets and is not hieratic Egyptian.
Then another one that doesn't match. Here's a little thing that kind of matches, but there's no textual match. And then a whole bunch of, and then a whole bunch of things that don't match. So what you had were, for the most part, these don't match, but you do get a couple of partial matches. So that's a bunch of details. Let me then summarize this for you, okay? 17 or 65% of the characters in the Book of Abraham manuscripts don't appear anywhere at all in the alphabets and grammar and so on. So 65% of them appear nowhere. 8 have partial matches. Of those, 13 partial characters don't match, but 8 do. None of those textually match. So there's a 0% textual match. 2 characters are used outright, and one of those has a textual match. But that's not in the Book of Abraham text, but it's in the margins before the text begins. So again, we have a 0% match in the text, but 4% overall, meaning conservatively, we can say that 96% of the characters do not have a text and character match. Right, so 96% of the time, the characters in the margins of the Book of Abraham translation have no match at all in the alphabet and grammar. So, by the numbers, if we're going to look at this, 170 characters, if we count all the different things, are in the Gale or AE. 16 have textual matches, 12 are strong, 2 others are fairly strong. One of these also has a character match, and 2, when we re- or deconstruct them, have portions that match. So what we end up with is 81% of the text does not have a character match, but only 1.8% of all characters have characters and text that match, which means that 98% of the time they don't match. Right? 98% of the time there's no match whatsoever. So if we're going to look at the Book of Abraham characters, 96 to 100% of the times they don't match. And if we look at the characters in the Gale and the Egyptian alphabet, 98% of the time they don't match. So what that tells us is that we don't know what the relationship we don't know what the relationship is, but we do know what it's not. It can't be the way that it's been suggested that they use the grammar and alphabet to translate those characters in the Book of Abraham manuscripts, because either in 96 or 98% of the time that doesn't work, and those are fairly high numbers, right? So what are the ramifications? Well, it looks like the way that we typically form that part of the hypothesis, we have to reject it.
Muhlestein's statistical summary of what he has presented adds up to 0 apologetic points, because as I have discussed, he is arguing against a straw man. No one seriously believes Joseph Smith made an alphabet and grammar to use in a conventional way to translate the Book of Abraham. However, he has provided good reason to reject the reverse translation theory, which posits that certain men used Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Abraham to construct an alphabet and grammar. According to Muhlestein's superficial analysis, that is not possible. He has even argued that the underwater character was copied from the margins of the translation manuscripts into the alphabets and Gale, but has given us no explanation for why the majority of other characters were ignored, if they were indeed reverse engineering Joseph Smith's translation.
So to summarize, with the logic test, we reject that the grammar and alphabet was used as a tool of translation.
Because the alphabets and Gale are primarily not about the Book of Abraham, at least not directly, they do not violate Muhlestein's logic test. However, the logic does seem to apply if one dates the translation of the Ketumen passage in the Valuable Discovery notebooks before the alphabets. We know the pure language dates to at least a few months before the purchase of the papyri. W. W. Phelps's transcription of Abraham 1 verses 1 through 3 may have indeed predated the Gale. The remainder of the characters in the alphabets come from the columns that flank facsimile 1 and should be regarded as an independent translation of a different set of characters than the ones used to produce the Book of Abraham. So Muhlestein's logic test is irrelevant.
With the historical test, well, we suggest we reject it. It's not a strong rejection. The historical test, it's a strong rejection.
Muhlestein's historical test consisted of showing that no one saw Joseph Smith using the Gale to translate, but instead saw him receiving revelation, or perhaps using his seer stone. I certainly have no problem with this. However, some, including Nibley, were misled by the statement in Joseph Smith's history that he translated an alphabet to the Book of Abraham. This allowed Nibley to assume a connection without bothering to actually test the claim. Nibley's reverse translation theory was formulated with this assumption in mind. Some critics may have also been led by Joseph Smith's history to assume the Gale was about the Book of Abraham. However, today we know more about the content of the Gale. And no serious student of the subject claims Joseph Smith used the Gale to translate the Book of Abraham. There's just too much missing.
And with the document test, at least the way it's most often formulated, we have to reject it, which suggests, again, we reject the whole hypothesis. And so I would assume that once we've turned this assumption into a hypothesis, we have to reject it.
I agree that the Gale was not used to translate the Book of Abraham in a conventional way. However, I do not believe the Gale as a translation tool theory is the way it is most often formulated. That is a straw man argument. But it also means that the reverse translation theory must be rejected.
And that means really we're best served by moving on. If we want to understand what's going on with the alphabet and grammar, let's not keep spending our time on a hypothesis that we now know does not work. Let's spend our time looking into other possibilities, and maybe then we can come to understand them better. Thank you very much.
I agree. Our time is better spent trying to understand the alphabets and Gale on their own terms, and not polemically. However, the apologetic community can't move on until Guy and Muhlestein state clearly that the reverse translation theory is wrong. In his interview with Scott Gordon that followed his presentation, he seemed not to understand the obvious implications of his own analysis and still wanted to hold on to the reverse translation theory, although he seemed to sense it was beginning to slip.
What are some of the other possibilities for understanding the nature of the Gale if it were not used for the translation of the Book of Abraham?
Now, I would say right now my best guess is that once they had a translation, they were trying to recreate a grammar, but it seems to me like even that is too simplistic, that there's something more going on, and I don't profess to understand what it is, but I hope that we'll put our energy into something more worthwhile at this point.
Mr. Muhlestein, it's not going to make sense as long as you maintain the reverse translation theory in any form. Your own analysis shows that the Gale was not used to translate the Book of Abraham. This means the model you are using, that the Book of Abraham was used to create the alphabets and Gale, also doesn't work. Once you discard the reverse translation theory, you will no longer need to defend other inventions, such as your assertion that the entire Book of Abraham, and probably more, was translated in 1835, which in turn requires the unsupported assertion that the Hebrew terms and Hebrew-inspired phraseology were added to a pre-existing text in 1842. Because there is no end to the invention of ad hoc theories or escapes, scholars tend to favor the theory that requires the fewest.
What do you believe? Is it the missing scroll theory? Is it the catalyst theory? And why?
It depends on what day you ask me and what hour of the day you ask me. To be honest, I don't think we have a model that can account, and I've said this in print before, and I'm sure I'll say it again. I don't think we have a model that can account for all of the evidence that we currently have. And so it's difficult to know what theory to go with, and I actually find that comforting and to be expected. When it was frustrating for a while, and then I thought about it, and I thought, well, if we are dealing with revelation coming from the divine, I don't know why I would expect to be able to easily fully understand the process or the little bits of evidence that we have. And so it actually, to me, the fact that we can't find a model that works is a testament that there's something beyond our normal abilities at work here, and I believe that's God.
So, your inability to come up with a viable apologetic is evidence of the divine? It sort of sounds like a God of the Gaps argument. Let's be clear, Mr. Muhlestein. A straightforward reading of the evidence shows that Joseph Smith could not, by any means, translate the Egyptian language, but pretended to by creating a so-called Egyptian alphabet and grammar, and inventing characters to fill the lacunae. This explanation fits the evidence. You don't like this conclusion, and so you spend a great deal of time trying to escape it. No matter the theory, there are always going to be outliers that can't be explained. That's just the nature of large data sets, and people typically underestimate the probabilities of coincidence, especially when they are willing to lower their critical standards. But your theories do not work, and therefore do not overcome what the evidence clearly shows. In my recent book, Book of Abraham Apologetics, I discuss the weaknesses of the reverse and long scroll theories, with a view towards establishing a better understanding of the contents of the alphabets in Gael, and how that related to Joseph Smith's goals as a religious leader. The Book of Abraham provided clarification and support for new doctrines he was attempting to introduce, like the high and patriarchal priesthoods, limiting the role of blacks in the patriarchal government he was attempting to establish in Missouri, and the doctrine of pre-existence. I welcome a shift in Mormon apologetics away from the failed reverse translation theory of Muhlestein and Gee towards a more fruitful exploration of the Book of Abraham in its 19th century setting. If you are watching this video, Mr. Muhlestein, I would advise you to consider seriously the idea that Joseph Smith engaged in deception to convince his followers that he had translated the Book of Abraham from the papyri in order to endow his own ideas, which he may have considered inspired, with the authority of antiquity. Isn't it time to come clean, Mr. Muhlestein, and at least admit which theory is the strongest, and stop hiding behind lame excuses like everyone has biases? I'm Dan Vogel. Thanks for watching.